I'm very excited about this conversation. I have butterflies before each time we speak.
Me too. Anticipating it was germinating for me. When I was walking this morning, and I had been at Rebel Wisdom yesterday doing all this work. I actually ran the Dialogos workshop, talking with Jordan Hall and with Nora Bateson, and then all of that was in my mind, and then all the work that Chris and I have been doing, and then our previous dialogue about soul. All of that just sort of came together for me, and so I wanted to propose something to you. I don't know if you got a chance to read that email I sent.
Yes, and I love the idea that you might have a theory about Hans or something to do with beauty, right?
Yeah. Well, no. What I want to do is, so I have two motives for this. Two reasons. I think they're more than just motives. I think I can justify them. I think they're reasons. So one is, I think it's an argument that's designed to try and not completely answer all your questions, but at least give an integrated way of it answering the questions that you posed. So I thought it would act as an excellent platform for the discussion, because it's going to talk about beauty and soul and dialogos, all of that.
Great.
And then what I also wanted to do was I wanted to start playing, and I mean in serious playing with, what does argumentation look like now within dialectic, right? What does that look like? Because right now we're doing a lot of this other stuff, and we can talk a little bit later about what I did in the workshop if you want, and it's all great. You're doing this amplification and you're doing all this work, and I was already getting people to start moving off of propositions into I propose that, and and that kind of move. But I also want to try and start playing with, okay, but because argumentation, dialectic is not for closure, right? And it's not about coming to a conclusion. So what role does argumentation have? So what the thought that came to mind is exactly what I'm proposing here, that an argumentation is kind of like a setting forth of a platform that is supposed to lead to something beyond the argumentation as the dialectic unfolds. Well, anyways,
okay. I could just step back just a little bit and say that our last conversation was about, I proposed this notion of soul.
Yes.
Guys, and I asked you to speak about that. And then John came up with the idea of reinventio, which is the Latin word for reinventing.
Yes.
And reinventing, which also means discovering, right?
Yes.
Have I got that right? And I also thought rediscovering, because these notions are very old. So what we're inventing and we're discovering at the same time. And I then after our conversation, I thought, geez, we could reinvent everything, We could reinvent soul, we could reinvent beauty, we could reinvent the world, I don't mean to be inflationary, but it's like, if we're moving into a new paradigm, we have to reinvent how we see practically everything, right?
But that's exactly right, Andrew. I think reinventio is one of the central functions of dialectic. It's reinventio that's a reanimation. If it's going to be a metapsychotechnology, it has to be able to reinventio all over the place if it's going to be effective and functional for us. I think that's a pivotal point you just made there. I don't think it's inflationary at all. I think the job of this is to exactly allow us to return to wherever we want to speak and find how to reanimate it and bring the logos to it.
Because all of these concepts become lifeless in a sense, and they become cliches and they become truisms and they stop meaning something. And yet we have a sense that they're deeply meaningful on some level, but we stop using them in any meaningful function. And the only way we could bring them back is by, let's say, redefining them. Which also is not just redefining the words; it's redefining how we see the world in a sense.
Yes, and reforming ourselves in the face of that. What kind of transformation do we have to undergo to conform to the reality that's being disclosed? Because whenever there's a disclosure, there's also a demand on us that we need to conform to that new disclosure if we're going to realize it. And so I think what I think you've provided me a good way of reframing what I was saying earlier. I think there's a better way of saying it. I want to try and reinventio argumentation so that it's no longer what it has become, which is just the logical coherence of propositions in order to just establish a conclusion that's supposed to defeat your enemy. I want to try and understand what was going on in the Socratic use of argumentation,
Uh-huh.
because very often those arguments don't come to conclusions. In fact, the arguments devolve into something else.
Yeah. And the problem perhaps with arguments generally is, as you say, they're rivalrous.
Yes.
They're painful. Whereas probably a good argument, if you come into the right spirit, probably has some kind of a joy associated with it. If the two people are having a wrestling match, you might disagree, but I think we're afraid to kind of disagree. We're in the social media age, we're afraid to wrestle with each other on some level.
That Plato is a nickname because it means broad shoulder because he was a wrestler. Platon, right?
And you're a martial artist.
And so, the point, I was saying this in the workshop yesterday, the point is not being right. The point is to come into right relationship, both with the topic and the other person. That's what respect originally meant. Respect, spectio, res, to see the thing properly. It doesn't mean the same thing as you and I be. And I said, what we're trying to do is steer a middle path, a very Buddhist notion, between merely attacking people or merely agreeing with them. We're trying instead to afford each of us getting to a place where we can't get to on our own.
Right. Because if we have too much agreement, then we fall into a bubble of some kind.
Yes.
And things get very dull and cliche. But if we're too antagonistic, then we just, then it's just blood everywhere, and nothing. We don't develop friendships and that kind of thing.
Well, there's no conduction to respect, and I want to reinventio that because it's also been trivialized by some of the social justice discourse. But notice, again, to resonate with another topic we're going to hopefully bring into discussion today, notice how both agreement and antagonism lead to an ugliness of speech, right? The one is the ugliness of dead conformity. The other is the ugliness of confrontation and threat. And again, trying to instead get back to what it is to beautify speech. I want to try and get argumentation, and Chris and I were talking about this, is like that my thinking isn't set and then I speak it to convince you. It's instead, as I try to articulate to you my thoughts, I'm actually reinventioing my thoughts, that in speaking them, I discover something in the speaking that I didn't have before I spoke them to you. That's what I'm really trying to get at.
So this
the wrestling metaphor works well for that purpose too, because if you think every particular proposition, every proposed speech act, in the way that you and I have talked about it, John, makes a particular space in the interaction. And so the entire form of the dialogue is an act of spatialization, right? That you test the spatial awareness of your body even as you exert and are exerted by your dialogic partners. So the co-creative act is actually an act of using the form of embodiment, in this case, the embodiment of speech itself, as a way of making exploratory space to then venture ever further into that space. And definitional discussions are interesting for that reason, because if we're thinking of the definition of a term as multivocal as soul or dialogue or love or any of the things that we might be able to put into this arena and then rest with, are really... I think it's helpful to think metaphorically of each of these definitions as spaces in which to play. That the definition is something to be inhabited in order to then illume more territory around it, as opposed to something that we treat as leading to a fixed point of closure.
I think that's exactly right. And that's where, as when I was doing the workshop, I tried to move people, I made people actually engage in the speak act, to remember that proposition originally comes from the speech act of I propose, which is not the same thing as this is the case, right? Those are very different things. I'm trying to bring that back out.
It's the metonymy again, right? Everything is put for something greater.
Yes, exactly.
Put for something beyond it. So everything, if there's an acknowledgement that every proposition, every gesture in the dialogue is abbreviated, knowingly and self-consciously abbreviated, then it always has its eye fixed beyond its point of meaning.
Beautiful, yeah. So it never becomes reified or stuck, and there's always a living force moving through it. Which again, I think all of these things keep coming together in my mind, which leads to soul and beauty, because because what has soul is what is alive, right? What continues to move through us, and what is beautiful is also what is alive, and what is meaningful, and not what is stuck and frozen and broken and fragmented and ugly and right.
No, sorry, I spoke over you, Andrew. I didn't mean to. I was excited when you said, all of these things are coming together in your mind, because that's the original meaning of logos, to bring things together so that they come to belong together. And that's something much, much more than what we reduced it to. Logos is the basis of our word logic, and we've reduced that to a coherence between propositions. But what you were talking about there, Andrew, about how things come together so they belong together, and they're ensouled together and become alive together, that's the meaning of logos. And logical coherence is only one aspect of that much richer manifold.
Right. So we're trying to reinvent logos.
Yep.
All right. To mean something not in this narrow logic, just a logician's kind of game. And we're also trying to. What about my friend Alexander always talks about mythos and pathos as well.
Sure.
That those two kind of work together. So mythos is the story, is the form of the story, and pathos is the deep sort of feeling aspect to it. And if we get too hung up on logos, we lose our sense of feeling. And if we get too hung up on mythos, the story becomes too sealed or closed. Or I'm making sense here, and that all those three need to work together: logos, mythos, and pathos.
That's what makes. Go for it, John.
Okay, I'll go ahead. I was just going to say, but that's the point of the. When you're doing the dialectic, when you're reading one of the dialogues, this is a point I think is really important that Drew Hyland and others have made. You don't pay attention to just the argumentation. The argumentation is where you see the putting forth of propositions, but the drama is where you see the putting forth of ways of life. And drama is exactly where the mythos and the pathos. That's why Plato does his philosophy in dialogue, because it's only in dialogue that you can get the wedding of the drama and the discourse so smoothly together.
Yes, exactly. And only in the dramaturgical context can logos to have a questing character, right?
Yes.
There is an implicit narrativity to the dialogues precisely because there's a quest, right? And that's why the dialogues are such a beautiful marriage of the logos and the mythos, because the characterization of the quest of logos is implicit to the function of the dialogue itself.
Yeah, the questions, which are propositional, are actually just the affordance of the speech act thinking of questing. That's exactly the right way to put it, Chris. I think that's really good.
Yeah.
So shall I begin some of my proposals?
Please, yeah.
So maybe let me go through sort of the four main things, the proposals, and then we can go back and trace through it however you gentlemen wish to. And then we'll just follow, as Socrates often says, we will follow the argument wherever it goes. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to do was I wanted to bring up the connection. So I want to first I'll make clear to everybody who might be listening that Andrew was very kind to send a set of questions. And I thought, originally I was just going to think about how I was going to answer each question, but then I thought maybe what I should do is try and logos. I should try and draw them together into mutually supporting proposals. And so so Andrew had some questions, and he's just also spoke it earlier about connections between beauty and soul. And so I want to pick up on our previous discussion about this idea of the reinventio of soul as that which mediates metaxu, is the alive in betweenness between moreness and suchness, and we talked quite a bit about that.
The mediator.
Yeah.
The soul is the mediator, like. I don't know if you know this movie Metropolis. This very old.
Of course I do.
You talk to the mediator as the guy who brings together the head and the hands.
The heart brings together the head
and the heart. So
yeah. My wonderful partner.
John has a big poster of Metropolis.
Yeah, my wonderful partner has given me the original, like a print of the original poster for Metropolis. That movie just sings to me repeatedly. So yeah, it's a beautiful illusion, Andrew. Thank you for that. Okay, so I was thinking about, so when we come back and review the first proposal, I was thinking, especially what you said, because Andrew, about Han's book on saving beauty, because I also think it's a really important work, and so we can come back to that. But I was thinking, so I've been thinking a lot about beauty, and of course, because it plays this very important role in beautification within the dialogues. And so I was thinking about the correlation between soul and beauty that you were making, Andrew. Mm-hmm. I want to unpack that in this proposal. So I want to propose to you that there's a continuum. There's a continuum in our experience right? And now I'm doing a tonos, attention, right? There's a continuum between experiences that emphasize suchness and experiences that emphasize moreness. So overwhelming moreness is horror, right? And then a little less overwhelming is awe. A little less overwhelming is wonder. Now let's go on the other side. When you're really picking up on the suchness, people express that with this positive term of intimacy. I know you intimately, right? And then if that's taken a little bit deeper, people talk about being at peace with each other. And then even more deeper, a sense of being at home with someone. And you know, Chris, what I'm doing here, I'm picking up on, right, home and horror as aspects of the sacred, right? But if we take it too far, we get that thing where, right, it becomes too enclosed, right? What I'm proposing to you is the following. Beauty is that sweet spot. It's the sweet spot on that continuum. It's kind of a meta-optimal grip, right? It's the tonos between being alive to the moreness and wonder and being alive to the suchness and intimacy. And this is picking up on Skari's notion that when I encounter something beautiful, I both get a sense of, wow, she gives the example of the tree, right? You come across a beautiful tree. And I didn't know trees could be like that. There's a sudden moreness. But this tree is also not like any other tree. It has a suchness to it, an individuation to it that is, right, non-repeatable. There's a here-ness and now-ness that's precious. So the intimacy gives a preciousness, if you'll allow me that. Sorry, I sound like Golem and I shouldn't, right? To the moreness. So the moreness is not an abstract conception. It's presence, right, into the suchness. So you see what I'm trying to do, Andrew, here? I'm trying to propose to you that the faculty of soul that mediates between moreness and suchness is actually the faculty of the reception of beauty. That because beauty is the aesthetics, the forming of our sensibility, that's finding that sweet spot between the moreness of wonder and the intimacy of suchness. And so I think that picks up on Skari's notion of how beauty is actually a deep kind of training for us. Okay, so that's the first proposal. The first proposal is that there's a deep, so I think you had a really important insight there, Andrew, and you see what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to propose how to unpack it, and that's what the argument's doing. It's saying, here's some things that I think come from that, unfold from that. So that's the first proposal. Is that okay?
Yep.
Here's the second proposal. The second proposal is a notion of wisdom that I get from Socrates, of the relationship between wisdom and virtue. That each virtue is just a particular way of being wise in a particular kind of situation. So being wise in this situation is to be courageous. To be kind to be wise in this situation is to be kind. To be, right? So the idea is that virtues are particular instantiations, particular ways of fitting, right, to a particular context. So now making use of Aristotle's notion of, of virtue always being between too much and too little. So now I'm going to try and draw them together. Here's the logos in the proposal. I think that wisdom has a moreness aspect to it, a self-transcendent aspect. And the Greeks had a word for this aspect of wisdom. This was Sophia. This is the moreness. But they also had another word that's often translated as wisdom, and we've lost this, right, in our translations, because we translate them both by the same word. They had phronesis. And phronesis was the ability to fit yourself well to a particular situation, right? So Sophia is the moreness, and you see what I'm doing here? It's the ability to pick up and resonate with the moreness. Phronesis is the ability to pick up and resonate with the suchness.
So it's the
Okay.
very small and the very big.
Well, it's the
or
also
it's the most intimate and the most
comprehensive.
Comprehensive. Okay.
Yeah.
So then
It's how- Go ahead.
the espousal of a particular virtue in fittedness to a particular situation is precisely the phronesis dimension of wisdom.
That's right. Right.
The
But
fittingness of
that's
that.
right.
Mhm.
But the picking up on how there's always so much more behind any aspect of wisdom, right? That there's so much more to being kind than what just happened here. That's the Sophia. Because the kindness that I show towards Andrew is not the kindness that I show towards my son. And it is not the kindness that I show towards my partner or the kindness I show towards my student, right? There's more to kindness, but notice that's the Sophia, but being kind to Andrew in the right way as distinct from how I'm kind to Spencer, right? That's the phronesis. Did that work? Did that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now I can put these two together. Virtue is the beauty of wisdom. Because beauty is to get the moreness, the sweet spot between the moreness and the suchness. And wisdom, right, is virtue is where you bring the moreness into the suchness. That's what virtue is. So virtue is the beauty of wisdom.
Virtue is wisdom.
This is why Plato says you start first by looking at the beauty of physical things, and then what the physical things have in common. And then he moves this move, which many people have found mysterious, but he then goes to say, then you consider the beauty of virtue. But that's because that's the move that gets you in. That's the form of beauty that is particular to wisdom. And this is the beautification. This is the kind of beauty that we're trying to make, right, in the dialectic. Okay, so that's the third proposal, that virtue is the beauty of wisdom. So this leads me to the fourth proposal. And you see how this is, right, that this is also an ensoulment process, Andrew? This is simultaneously, right? Because virtue is again that process of mediating appropriately between the more and the such. Okay, so dialectic, here's the proposal, the fourth proposal. Notice how this is not a strictly logically coherent argument. It's an argument, but it's a logos argument. I'm gathering things together and then gathering together and gathering together, right? Dialectic is the beautification of thought in speech in order to conform to virtue, and this is how we practice wisdom. So dialectic is the beautification of thought in speech in order to conform to virtue, and this is how we practice in wisdom. What does this imply? Dialectic is about virtue in two senses. Virtue is always the topic of every dialectic, and it is. Every dialogue is about a virtue. It is both the topic and it is the enacted tonus. We are supposed to be talking about courage in a dialogue, but we are also supposed to be enacting courage. And Socrates always exemplifies that. In fact, the enactment of courage takes precedent over, right, the topic, anything that is spoken about courage. The speaking and the enactment, right, the topic and the tonus are wedded together because the ultimate goal is to conform to virtue, to love the beauty of wisdom. So those are the four proposals.
Okay. I have one question about the word virtue, because it seems to be a word that's been kind of abused and it has a moralistic tone to it. Whereas it's actually a bigger word than that. It's a more, being virtuous doesn't mean being goody two shoes or something, you know. It doesn't mean just being good, right?
No, not at all.
There's a lot more to it than that. So I think maybe we should
unpack it,
define, and we should reinvent virtue as well, right? What that means.
So let's pick up on something that everybody's familiar with: virtual reality, the virtual world. Why do we use that term? Because the meaning of virtue is actually a power, right? It's a power in act. It's a potential. It's not just mere possibility. It's actually a living potential that's being enacted, right? It's being actualized. So the virtue of honesty is to have the potential, the set of skills, sensibility, and sense of self that when it comes into a particular situation will be actualized as courage or actualized as honesty. That's what a virtue means.
Which explains why the virtues are associated with the Platonic forms, because if the Platonic forms are these exponent powers of knowing, then the expression knowing in virtue, all of a sudden makes a whole lot of sense.
Exactly. And notice how we do that. We're knowing in virtue of, we're doing this in virtue of. Exactly. So what I'm trying to do, Andrew, I'm trying to do this thing. And I don't know if I'm succeeding or not. It's like an open, but you see what I'm trying, instead of just giving you, sentences about your particular question, I'm trying to logos them together. I'm trying to bring them together so they belong together and they unfold and they take on a life of their own. And they afford exploration. They afford more discussion. They afford more conversation. I'm not trying to foreclose on anything.
Yeah. Well, when you were talking about potential and relating that to virtue, I was thinking about soul again.
Yep.
And I was thinking that the soul is kind of an echo of the future, of your future potential, of the beauty that you could become.
Yes. That's well said. Notice what you've just done. When you said, of your potential futures, you're gesturing towards the moreness, but you're talking about what you could become. So the moreness is the mystery of participation. It's how we unfold into being. But the suchness is the mystery of our individuation, how we become what we particularly are, what we individually are. And Tillich's great insight, right, is that's the fundamental grammar, the fundamental tonos of human existence. We're always in tension between individuation and participation. And beauty is a way in which we enact and become virtuous within that tension.
Within that tension.
So Skari actually argues in her book, not that beauty is truth or goodness. She says that beauty, and this is one of her core arguments and inspired what I was saying here, that beauty is basically where we practice being just and we practice looking for the truth. We practice she uses what she's basically saying is beauty is where we practice the kind of seeing and being and talking and thinking that prepares us for moral virtues like honesty, which is perhaps also an intellectual virtue, and also intellectual virtues like wisdom and things like that. It prepares us for both of those. It's basically the schoolhouse for both the intellectual and the moral virtues. And that's what I'm trying to bring back here, because I think she's articulating something beautiful that was a central idea in Plato.
And that's kind of counterintuitive to how we think of beauty. We kind of think of beauty as something primordial that has nothing to do with, any kind of moral virtues. It's just, it doesn't have moral virtues. It's like, it's just a flower. It's just bare truth.
That brings up Han, right? That brings up Han. So notice what Han's saying with the aesthetics of the smooth, right? How he said how we've reduced beauty to things being smooth, right? Because smooth is comforting. It challenges us in no way. No. So to use my language, one of his complaints is, because he uses alterity, he said, we've lost the more, I'm using my language now, but I think it's perfectly consonant with it. We've lost the moreness of beauty. And
or the pathos also.
Yes. And so smoothness.
He talks about Jeff Koons and his his balloon dogs, and they're very cute and they're colorful, but they're not like Rodin. They don't have that gravity, right?
No,
they don't have this like intense gravity that beauty also has. Like it does pull you. It doesn't just send you off into bliss. It also brings you into the earth as well.
I think that's exactly right. So what I was picking up on in Han is smoothness. I mean, think about like the smoothness of caress. So smoothness marks out a kind of intimacy, but it's intimacy without challenge. It's an intimacy, and this is Han's point, that is deadening, right? It's deadening because the way in which beauty, right, affines the suchness and the moreness to each other, the educational aspect, educe, to draw out. That's being left out of beauty. That's Han's main
He
complaint.
says beauty is a veil. It's not everything being presented to you. It's always behind a veil.
That's right. Because it's always got moreness to it. Think about the veil again. The veil, again, it connotes an intimacy, but it also, right, there's a beyondness, right? There's a way in which it has the moreness. It recedes from you, and it challenges you. It draws you forth. It puts a demand on you. Every disclosure from it puts a demand on you to go through transformation, to keep in conformity with what has been disclosed. And that's the training for virtue. That's the training for truth. That's the training for goodness. Beauty is what actually trains us. And it's the common educational ancestor of the pursuit of truth and the pursuit of goodness.
Yeah. He also said, Han, that within the smooth, right, we don't even have a notion of ugliness anymore.
That's right.
There's no gravity to ugliness either. So, and it occurred to me that in order to understand beauty, right, we also have to understand, the ugliness of our world, or the ugliness of when we depart from beauty. Like, we need that contrast. We need that dialectic. We can't just, again, this is why you probably mentioned horror, in some sense, because there's beauty is tearing you to pieces on some level.
Well, if it's taken too far, right? And that's what Rilke said. Right. But I think what you're pointing to, Andrew, and I'm going to shut up so Chris can talk. But what you're pointing to is what I'm trying to argue for. Notice that when you started bringing in, and this is what I think Han is doing, when you want to bring in that contrast and you want to enhance it, you're talking about a normativity. You're talking about judgments. There's something deeply wrong with ugliness. There's something contrastively deeply right. And I think the only way we can do that without falling into facile definitions is to realign beauty with virtue again. Ugliness is conducive to vice, as virtue is as beautiness is conducive to virtue. Mm-hmm. That's what I want to say. Mm-hmm. That gives it back its gravitas. Yeah.
I think in order for that to be possible, that particular reinventio of beauty, it has to be understood transjectively. It has to be a property of the relation with being, and not a property that presents as an object of the world.
Oh, totally.
Right? Because, much of what we consider to be ugly on its face can be pronounced beautifully within the right frame of perspective, within a frame of perspective that is attentive selectively to certain detail. The ugliness can be bared beautifully.
Like, you could see beauty in decay, for example.
Absolutely. You can see beauty in absolute squalor. Yeah. And but in that case, beauty is the affinity of your particular relation to your like. I mean that's why beauty emerges so naturally within dialogue, because it's an affined property of the relation between the I and the thou. And in the same way that it is in the matrix of the dialogue between persons, so it is perceptually, right, in terms of your relationship with your being in the world itself. It's a property of that relation that you strike.
I think that's exactly right. And I was trying to portend that when I was talking about it as meta-optimal grip. And I'm alluding back to the previous discussion the three of us had about soul as the faculty of faith, where faith isn't any closure, right? Faith is actually maintaining right relationship through change. And I think that's what I'm trying to say. Beauty is exactly. It's a faithful right relationship. It's transjective between you. It's not in the eye of the beholder, nor is it in the object, but is your relationship to the world a virtuous one or a vicious one?
That's right. That's right.
It has to do with renewal too. Renewing. When you brought faith in, I thought it's renewing your vows constantly. It's renewing.
Yes. It's exactly that. We're exemplifying it here. The reinventio is that renewing, because we're constantly trying to breathe new life into these terms so that we can do exactly what I'm talking about here. Exactly.
Great.
That's right. That's right. The logos cannot gain any traction in realism without beauty for that very reason.
So it's really interesting because when I was doing the workshop with people, because what it came to me, Chris, as a practical consequence of this, because I'd always wondered, and Cornford and others have made sort of this weird thing about Socrates. I always wondered why the dialogues always figure on virtues, either moral virtues or intellectual virtues. And then I realized that's not happenstance. That is not happenstance. Dialogos has to always be about the topic of virtue, and it always has to be the enacted tonos of virtue. Though that is not happenstance. That's how you get the metonymy. What you're talking about is actually, right, metonymically related to what you're actually enacting. That is not a coincidence, and it's a necessity of the very constitution of dialectic. We have to be talking about a virtue as we enact it, we resonate between. There's no other way.
Right. In order for the meaning and the meta-meaning to be properly affined into relation,
Exactly.
in order for the meaning of the logos to become conversant with the meaning of the logos, the higher order meaning of the logos that gathers the entire dialogue, you have to start with its metonymic child in order to then aspire to the parent, if I can put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think that's right. So what has been happening when other people have been doing some of these experiments about trying to bring argumentation, and they just bring in a topic like a problem, and it doesn't go anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But when I told people, I meant in the sense of instruction, I said, no, this is what you're going to do. We're going to break up into groups of 4, right? And then what you're going to do is the 4 of you are going to choose a virtue. And then one person is going to begin by saying, I propose, let's say, honesty is this. And the other person is going to amplify it. They're going to say, well, can you say a little bit more? Or I noticed you were making this gesture. They're going to try and reveal the beauty of how the person is enacting it and use that as a scaffold for getting them to say more and more and more. And then the second person has to come to a place, right, where, right, the first person sort of said, I'm done. And the second person says, well, this is what I understood you to be saying. And they have to make sure that they understand them, right? The first person has to be heard. And then the second person has to say what they appreciate about it, not only in the sense of understanding, but what was valuable. What did they see that they didn't see before? And then they have to say what was missing, what was mysterious, what was slightly off. And then what they do is when they do that and they turn to the next person, they do what was off, what was missing, and then they make their proposal about what honesty is. And you keep cycling that through people. And then what you do is you get the groups, and you bring all the groups together. And this group was doing courage, this group was doing honesty, and you get all the groups, and you say, okay, now, what is virtue itself? And you know what everybody keeps talking about how they were amazed by how the topics just exploded, and they felt deeply engaged because they're enacting and they're seeing them. And then they're all willing to do this, what normally people say they don't like to do. They're willing to go into this abstract discussion about what is virtue itself.
It's anagoge. That's what you're describing is a simulation of the anagogic process. Right.
Well, it's a simulation of both the sensibility transcendence and the anagoge, because when you're doing that appreciation, that's the sensibility transcendence.
I'm not sure if I understand the term anagogic. I've heard it before. Yeah. Can you clarify that just a little bit? What you mean by anagogic? Is that like analogy? Is like making an analogy?
No. And although I think for all kinds of reasons they're deeply interpenetrating. But no, what I mean by anagogy is the kind of the ascent to theosis that's associated with graduating orders of ontological abstraction. So that when Plato talks about that the questing eros ventures from beautiful bodies to beautiful customs to beautiful ideas and so forth.
Got it. I remember now.
It's the reciprocal opening that's also a kind of ontological transcendence, right?
That's right. And so the idea then being that the reciprocal opening that happens interpersonally between dialogists symbolizes the process of the reciprocal opening that happens anagogically in your relationship with the world itself. Mm-hmm. That somehow is the logos of those.
So anagogy is the continual transcendent movement.
Yes.
And let's say, and then there's the other movement, which is the grounding movement. What would you call that?
That's the intimacy. That's the sensibility transcendence.
Suchness.
This is a term from John Wright.
That's the suchness, right?
You and I really getting really mutually fitted to each other, really mutually fitting each other more and more and more, right? So, and that's where the amplification process I'm talking
It's
about.
like breathing in and breathing out in a sense.
Yeah,
Very
but
much so.
hearing it,
Precisely.
we're respiring. I mean, that, before it became a vicious term, that's what conspiring meant. It meant to breathe together, right?
Yeah. Which is also why the diagnosis of despair, as Kierkegaard figured it, had everything to do with asphyxiation and hyperventilation, right? Not being able to get a purchase on your proper relation with being, the particular sickness of the soul, that is despair, is precisely not being able anymore to respire. In this new language now, John, respire between your suchness and moreness.
Yeah, exactly.
So then the reinventio, the process of then this anamnesis of reinventio that we're undertaking, is in some ways a process of renewing our respiration.
Bringing breath, into the
immediate
breathing life would be the more
right. And that's the original metaphor for souling, right?
Yeah, because the soul is related to the breath, isn't it?
Right, the pneuma,
the pneuma.
Very much.
Yeah.
So
that
it was
listeth as
amazing
it bloweth.
When people were in this practice, like, of course, it was the first time I did it, and dialectics should be on top of a whole bunch of other an ecology of practices, and there should be a whole educational program before you get into it. But it never, it's the first time, so it was very clunky in a lot of ways. But nevertheless, the way people were clearly resonating, the moreness and the suchness, and they were willing, like they were starting to get caught up in the beauty of it, and it was interesting to see how people they're starting to catch in the light of their eyes. Wait, and because it's making virtue come alive to them, but not as a topic, but as a way of being, right? It was very exciting,
and a multi-dimensional way of being, rather than just however, whatever our very reductive versions of all of these concepts are.
Yes.
I guess when you enter into their aliveness, that's exciting. That's like, okay, wow, there's life here. It's not just a world of dead language or something.
Exactly. And notice
it's poetic, and you can feel the poetry of it, right?
Exactly. It's poesis. Notice, like, think about when a poet, I write poetry, right? When you're writing poetry, it's exactly that process of, it's reinventio, because as you're speaking these words, you discover a thought in them that comes back to you from the words. Like, that's what's happening when you're doing poesis. And notice that the connection, that's the connection you were intuiting, Andrew, between the aliveness, the ensoulment, and the beauty. We're doing all of those together, but these are just three different aspects of the very same thing.
Wonderful.
It also happens not only when you're writing poetry, but when you're writing dramatically. That's precisely what happens, right? Because the whole process of rendering character is precisely that you're giving such a form to you're embodying the virtue, and in the embodiment of the virtue as such, you're giving it a particular formal, the formalization in context of virtue, I think, emerges as character.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's so important, because we really need to reinvent art as well, because we need to bring narrative art back in.
Absolutely,
that's how we embody a lot of these things. That's how we go to the next level, perhaps.
Yeah, that's one form of gathering the logos, right? Gathering the logos is precisely the process of dramatic characterization. You play through, in an exploratory fashion, you play through the embodiment of virtue. And that's why deep forms of characterization are justly celebrated, because they disclose an unconcealed dimensions of being in virtue that are otherwise unavailable to us. That's what good storytelling does. That's why we revere good storytelling, is because it immerses us. It immerses us in an embodied, enacted fashion into the moreness of being in virtue.
Yeah,
this connection between character, which is the faculty of virtue, and characterization in drama. That's brilliant, Chris. I hadn't thought about that. That's exactly right. You know that Keith Oatley, he's one of my colleagues at the University of Toronto, has all this research showing that, you know, working with drama, working with literature is our primary way of training ourselves to be more virtuous.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which also means it doesn't mean, again, I'm trying to get away from this sentimental idea of virtue. Because in drama is usually about going into the human darkness, right? Going into the horrors, right? It's often that way. I mean, a tragedy is that.
Right.
In any case, you know, Kurtz goes into he sees the horror, and that's.
But Marlo.
So there's no. It's not just beauty as some kind of really terrible sort of like sentimental version of reality.
No.
It's something else, huh?
But look at.
I always want to bring gravity to these concepts when we talk about them because they have become because. You know, it becomes so Disneyland.
No, virtue is the power to lead a good life in all the dimensions of goodness. That's what virtue is. It doesn't mean the moralistic, following rules, right? I'm thinking of, I want to live the kind of life that Socrates led, or the Buddha led, or Jesus of Nazareth led. And that can't be captured or reduced to following this rule or that rule or this rule.
Well, it's an adventure, isn't it?
It's an adventure to look out, to look beyond, right? And think about Marlowe in The Heart of Darkness, and think about the beauty of Conrad's prose. I know The Heart of Darkness is contentious because of colonialism, racism. I'm going to put that aside because that's another thing to talk about. But think about what Marlowe represents. Marlowe represents virtue in the face, right, of this. Because he practices self-restraint, and that's not reducible to any sort of he's not a prude. He's not just adopting a moralistic set of rules. He is constantly continuing the journey. He keeps good faith in that sense with Kurtz, but he dedicates himself to remaining true to his humanity. He practices. He keeps talking about self-restraint.
He doesn't get swallowed by the horrors, but he doesn't avert his gaze either. I remember, what was it, Kurosawa, when he was a kid, he walked through Tokyo after the earthquake, and there were corpses everywhere. And his brother said, look, you have to look, because the poet doesn't avert his eyes or. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that Marlowe, I think Marlowe finds the sweet spot that I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
he's open to the horror, but the self-restraint is he maintains that intimacy with himself. He maintains intimacy with his suchness, and he maintains those two, and that is what actually affords him going on the journey, the quest.
Mm-hmm.
And how does he, one of the ways formally in which he does all of that is, think about the form of the novella itself. He's relaying the story to a chorus of onlookers, bearing witness to the very character that he's conveying, right? That's a story within a story. Yeah, and that's why that particular device, the inframing of the story with we were talking in our last conversation together, we were talking about the function of the heavenly host, the choral function of the moreness of the choral function of witnessing transcendently without being enclosed by the perspective of the character that's playing through. And that the way that the novella is structured lends that kind of higher order perspective that sees the narrative in virtue of its possibility, of its possible implications, of its possible meaning beyond its meaning, because he relays the story to the people on the boat. Right, and they're not saying anything. They're silent, but they're bearing silent witness to the very dynamic that he's exemplifying.
And so is the reader, because the story starts with the personal narrator and then takes you into that. Yeah, that's right. There's all the playing with that framing. That's really good. That's a great observation, Chris.
But it's to your point, and you too, Andrew. It's like that. There's a reason why. And there's a reason why there's such sublimity to that and similar narratives. It's precise, and it's precisely their inexhaustibility, right?
Yeah.
That the way in which they enact the narrative as such enacts patterns that intimate the moreness beyond the narrative as such. And then that moreness beyond the narrative as such is precisely what is enclosed and borne out by the witnessing presence that surrounds it, both the reader and perhaps the ancillary characters and onlookers.
And that's why, right, Conrad has Marlowe, and he explicitly says that Marlowe is sitting there like a Buddha at the end, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, that's amazing.
In the dark too, by the way.
Yeah.
In the dark.
Yeah.
I guess then there's the scene where the Buddha meets Mara or something, and Mara is him.
Exactly.
You know, he's.
So, Andrew, this was my attempt to not, like I say, I wanted to a way of like, can we bring, when somebody is asking us questions, can we reinventio argumentation, not as I'm going to like establish things, but what I'm going to do is logos. I'm going to try and gather a whole bunch of things together so they belong together, they sing together, they start to beautify each other, and then they afford discourse and discussion and involvement. That's what I'm trying, that's how I'm trying to reinventio argumentation here.
Mm-hmm.
The making of proposals and the consideration of how they fit together and belong together beyond just logical coherence.
I was also go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to say it's interesting because one of the things that happens is when you bring these particular definitions in proximity to one another, I'm going to personify them for a minute, but I don't think it's inappropriate to, given all our discussion about character. They begin to, the virtues, when they're brought within range of one another, allow us to see. They allow us to. I mean, the way in which they become conversant is that the virtues begin to know in virtue of one another.
Yes.
Right. So one virtue begins to know in virtue of its neighboring virtue, mm-hmm. and is then so articulated. It's a virtue knowing in virtue of another virtue, which sounds like a mouthful, but essentially that once you bring these things into proximity, they begin to know by means of one another. And in being so known by means of one another, the shared reflections of depth begin to appreciate.
This is an image you find in both the Neoplatonic Western tradition and the Buddhist Eastern tradition. So in the Eastern tradition, it's Indra's net. Right. So,
yes, you've mentioned that in one of your. I think Andrew, you mentioned that in one of our previous conversations. That image.
Everything is reflected in everything else.
Everything is reflected in everything else.
Faith is reflected in soul, which is reflected in virtue, which is reflected.
That's right. And they all become eyes. They all become eyes unto the world. Yeah.
Right. And Plotinus says, right, that all of the forms have exactly that relationship to each other. Right. They're all like Indra's nets. They're all reflect, and each one captures the moreness in its own particular suchness, for us it has to unfold in time, but for Plotinus that's happening sort of in eternity, and the logos of eternity, that sort of holographic intelligibility, we have to try and capture it in the sequential logos of speech as best we can. And that's exactly so that metaphor is exactly the resonant metaphor. The way the virtues speak to each other bespeaks, right, the ground of intelligibility itself.
Which is then again echoes with the analogy of the dialogic practice of the two conversation partners. Yep. So as we do between ourselves as conversation partners, so then do the virtues in virtue of each other.
Exactly. I like that turn of phrase, the virtues in virtue of each other. That's beautiful, Chris. The way you do that is so impressive.
Well, I'm just riffing off of you and you both.
But riffing is exactly the right thing. The jazz of this is, constitutive of its beautification. It's not just riffing. It's integral to what we're doing here. And that was what's really, and when we did the workshop and you got to people at the end, they were riffing off their own particular virtue that they discussed, courage or honesty, but they were jazzing. They were finding resonance and convergence, right, and divergence, but in a harmonious fashion between each other. They were doing the deep learning. They were converging and varying and converging and varying. It was beautiful.
Yeah. And sometimes, I like it when some jazz music just falls apart. Psychedelic music, or sometimes, when I listen to these, like the Grateful Dead, they just fall apart and the whole band just disassembles itself completely, and then they kind of find their way back to each other.
Oh yeah.
I think that's an interesting process, the falling apart and coming back together,
like recovering from an aporia.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say.
You go, and instead of going always for the high, right? Like pop music is always like an orgasmic, trying to be an orgasmic type of experience, or a complete orgasmic. Whereas the jazz is a deeper thing, because it doesn't always go for the peak, right? It falls into the valleys.
That's beautiful.
It lingers. Like that's another word that Han uses, I think. Yeah. Word lingering when it comes to beauty. It lingers a while, and then it lets itself go, and then it becomes intense again. And
but that's the aporia as criticality. In self-organizing systems, they get stuck, and what you have to do is you have to perturb them. You have to disturb them. Yeah. Right? They get to a point of criticality where they're almost breaking apart, falling apart, and only then
puncture them or something.
Structure. Yeah. Pardon me?
A puncture is the word that came to mind.
Yeah. Well, it's called punctuated equilibrium.
Interesting.
Yeah, when you were describing initially, John, in your open précis about the equilibrium between the suchness and the moreness, I think of the complexifying dynamic between the assimilation and the meta accommodation that you talk about within the cognitive science nomenclature. And it sounds like virtue. It sounds like it maps on more or less identically.
It does. I think virtue is very much about sort of getting. That's what it's a meta optimal grip on meta assimilation and meta accommodation.
Right.
Totally. And that, for those of you who are watching, I mean, this is discussed at length in some of the videos within Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and in some of the stuff that Chris and I have written. I think we talk about this in the zombie book, don't we?
Do we? I don't know. I don't know how. I don't think we get I don't think we get too deeply into the cognitive science vocabulary. But yeah, it's in there somehow. Yeah.
Do you guys know the work of René Girard? Because one of my questions for John was, and one of my thoughts about what beauty is, it's beyond mimetic desire on some level. It's when you experience uniqueness that is beyond imitation of some kind. It goes beyond this sort of, and that's what we're kind of looking for, because we're always trapped in a mimetic hall of mirrors on some level. We're copying each other, and we're stumbling around with concepts. At least I am. and then we kind of break through, and then we have this fresh moment that's beyond mimetic desire. Does that make any sense?
It makes total sense. And Girard's thing, I think, is apropos here, and his idea of Jesus undermining, like Jesus being the criticality. And think about the word critical and crisis and cross and how they're all related. Jesus being the criticality that disturbs that whole mimetic self-enclosure. I think that's exactly right, because the thing to do is remember that there's not always silent, but often silent partner. Because Girard is, his prototypical instance of what you're talking about, mimetic desire, is covetousness. Right, it's envy or jealousy, right?
Envy, yeah. He said envy is the most hidden desire, the one we don't admit to ourselves. So we're always being dragged around.
Right,
envy.
So compare envy to admiration, which is a virtue. What is it when you admire somebody and you don't envy them? Right? So think about eros as, so when I want to be one with someone, I can reduce that to consumption. I'm going to be one by consuming you. Or it can be an eros that is turning its face towards agape. I'm going to be generative, as Plato says. I'm going to generate beauty within beauty, right? So I'm going to try and create a life that is in some relevant sense similar to Socrates, but not Socrates. It's mine. I'm not trying to take from Socrates. I'm trying to generate in admiration. And so I think this is exactly what we're talking about here, right? If we have a beauty that's just the smooth, that is just the act of assimilation, consuming, making it one with me, in no way disturbing me, in no way being a critical moment for me. But if I have genuine beauty, then I'm going to be drawn beyond myself.
Yeah. But the critical moment also is perhaps recognizing one's envy at times, you know,
totally.
rather than just trying to aspire to an ideal, you know, state of admiration, is that we notice that we feel that way at times.
But that's exactly the point, right? This is to add to what you're saying about how we're trying to reinventio virtue. Socratic virtue is always inseparably bound up with self-knowledge, right? And it's the kind of, this is one of the great Socratic insights. There's aspects of myself that I can't know by introspection or even reflection. I can only know them in interaction with you, because they call forth both the potential for virtue and vice in me that I can't call forth in myself or make available to myself. But if I pay attention, if I come in good faith to the dialogue, I can become aware of my envy, and I can open myself up to a different possibility therein.
Yeah.
Because at that moment, you're no longer seeing through. You're no longer seeing and knowing by means of your envy when it becomes opaquely knowable to you as such.
When you
so
can
then
reflect it
the
back
possibility of transcending it becomes then available by knowing it.
I think that's a bit like the shadow as well, isn't it? About you.
Oh, totally.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
How
Exactly.
you get your shadows?
Exactly.
You get your shadows by how you have to pay it. If you just think you can do your shadow by just doing active imagination and sitting inside your room, you have missed Jung's point. You're going to get your shadow when you realize how you're projecting onto other people.
Yeah.
It's only when you recognize your projections and hear the other person's, right? Hear the other person behind what you've projected on them. When you open up to the otherness beyond your projection so they can break through the then and only then do you realize your projection.
Yes. And then the process of doing that could justly be called dialectical.
Of course. Of course.
So the beauty is perhaps also a moment of deep sincerity, right? Rather than, let's say pretension or
yeah, totally. I mean, so Socratic humility is important. I think that's the proper. We talked about this last time. The proper response to beauty is reverence, and reverence has humility within it, right? It's reverence is this bidirectional realization. You recognize who you are. There's an intimacy with who you are, and there's also a recognition of the moreness beyond you that can nevertheless afford your transformation.
And beauty is such too that it even as it contradistinguishes your supreme inadequacy, it also saves you from it.
Exactly.
Right?
It tells you
it kills you and it rescues you from the interminable death at the same time.
Exactly.
It inflicts upon you death without the undying death.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That makes me think of Ulysses. There's the Homeric version of Ulysses, and then there's James Joyce's Ulysses, and the character is so flawed. He's so human, right? So we have this ideal, and then we have our both those things, and he becomes the hero just through his I don't know, I guess through his authenticity on some level. That's just what came to mind when you were speaking about this.
No, I like that. I think that fits very well.
So what about the specific proposal of, because there's also a specific proposal I made about which is part of the reinventio of beauty, and also simultaneously the reinventio of virtue, to see virtue as the beauty of wisdom. And this is a different way. I'm trying to propose a different way of thinking about both virtue and beauty in light of, or in virtue of, wisdom itself. What do you think about that as a proposal? Because it's always been mysterious to me in Plato when he talks about the beauty of virtue and why we should care about it and why it's superior to sensual beauty. But if it's a way in which we're affine to wisdom itself, then I can understand why it should matter to us so much.
I think it makes it existentially available. It provides an entree into wisdom.
What's
that is ordinarily so
an entree
virtue, the virtue, right? So because virtue is both speakable and possessible, it's participable, right? It straddles both levels of signification. So you can speak about virtue.
That's right.
And you can inhabit virtue and embody virtue.
Exactly.
And so because of that, it provides a kind of access. It provides a way to inhabit beauty. So when you were talking about the idea of that beauty, when being in right relation to beauty is such that you can't have a consumptively mimetic relationship to it, which I think is a profound point. And yet also being in right relation to beauty is somehow also mimetic, in the sense that is that mimesis of that which is not imitatable. I don't know if that's a word, imitatable, but let's go with it. If mimesis of that which is not able to be imitated is precisely what induces the aporetic experience.
Oh.
And there's something about inhabiting the virtue that is it's an effort, and it's an effort to imitate that which is inimitable. That's the word I was fishing for.
Great.
Inimitable.
Fantastic.
It is the imitation of that which is inimitable, and that is precisely what induces the aporia. But the attempt to embody the virtue makes available the aporetic experience that is beautiful in its nature.
Is that why you would wear masks in theater, in a sense?
Yeah. I think that yes, absolutely.
Because you're trying to imitate something. That's the beauty of doing that, but that's beyond you on some level.
Absolutely. I mean, theater, but also I think of liturgy as well, right? In a more overtly religious sense, right? You are trying to imitate that which is inimitable. You're trying to effect a gesture toward a meaning that cannot be espoused in gesture, and yet that kind of aporetic effort, you're teetering on the precipice of intelligibility at that moment. But precisely that precarious point, that precarious edge that beauty walks, that, as John described it, that optimal balance of beauty between the horrific and the confirmed.
I have to admit, I'm having a hard time connecting beauty to wisdom. Those two things don't go together for me on some level. Well, perhaps again, this is my romantic disposition, because I always think that it's when you cast off any pretense of wisdom or non-wisdom, it's just a full embrace of some kind. But wisdom feels to me a step removed. Does that make any sense?
But for us,
perhaps this is me being argumentative in the sense.
No, this is a good point. This is a good point.
No, this is a good point.
I think so. Maybe one place to start is that beauty becomes a way of affecting profound changes in our attention, right? Beauty is what calls out and directs our attention. And attention can be subject to all kinds of self-deceptive patterns that recur, patterns that are enshrined and entrenched into forcible, habituated modes of being, or modes of having, I suppose. And what beauty does is beauty can debilitate those patterns precisely because it can recover our attention and repurpose it and refocus it. Mm-hmm. So I think maybe that's one way to start, is that I think of beauty as like the herald of wisdom, right? It's what calls our attention to it. It's not necessarily identical with it, but it is the very thing that it is the very thing that draws out aspiration, because it's capable of laying waste to the particular patterns by which we see and know at any given point in time.
Like the sirens that are calling to
like the sirens, right? Which is a great
the,
example of how it can be
and
used
the Cyclops
perversely.
And all the monsters
Yeah,
that call Ulysses to his doom, and somehow he has to make it home to his.
That's right.
To his wife, who has been surrounded by suitors and all that. So it's like, So there's always this. I get beauty is bound up in seduction and pathos, right?
It is, but it's also bound up in insight, right? And like we talked about this last time about the machinery and the attentional machinery of beauty is also the same machinery, especially if there's been criticality in it, right? You have to break out of a frame, right? Being struck by beauty, there's insight, and so if we get the training of attention and the affording of insight, these are integral to the cultivation of wisdom. They're integral to the cultivation of wisdom. That's why, that's why meditative practices have been associated with the cultivation of wisdom.
Yeah.
Because precisely what you're doing is training attention and affording insight.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It allows you, beauty somehow, the onset of beauty allows you to recast your form of life, recast your mode of being in relation. I think if we think of it as a fundamental relational dynamic, then it can refigure the way in which that is framed for you at any given moment.
You must change your life. Yeah,
you must change your life.
Rilke says, right?
That's right. Yeah, you must. Yeah,
that's what beauty. That's what beauty does. It tells us, very directly that some radical shift is necessary.
That's right.
So, virtue is the ability to take responsibility, to appropriately respond to how every true disclosure puts a true demand on you. Because the relationship between disclosure and demand is exactly proportioning the relationship between moreness and suchness, which is what I propose to you what beauty is. Okay. And I think insofar as we're trying to get the Sophia of wisdom and the phronesis of wisdom, that's virtue, and that's a kind of beauty.
Virtue is the right relation of beauty.
You get struck by beauty in a sense.
Yep.
And then the virtue is how you navigate that pathos. How do you navigate that?
I would say so. I would say
that thing that can bring out all the demons in you and also bring out your most heroic, soulful being, right? It can do both.
I think so. And this is what Plato, right? Philosophia is the virtue of it's the appropriate virtue to the experience of wonder. And just like reverence, Woodruff argues, is the appropriate virtue for the experience of awe.
But is philosophia one among the virtues, John, or is it the harmony of the virtues themselves? Well, I think of philosophia in a higher order sense. I think of it as the orchestration of the virtues.
Oh, it is, and I think but philosophia begins in wonder. Wonder has a special role for philosophia in the Platonic vision, because wonder is exactly the moment of what we've been talking about. It's the moment of, so if we contrast wonder to curiosity, where curiosity is there's something missing and I want to have it, which is good, but where wonder is I'm willing to call myself and my world into question. There can be no pursuit. So wonder has, I think, a special role. I think you're right. Philosophy is about all of the virtues, but to use your term, I think wonder is the entree. It is the right. Philosophia, first of all, is the virtue of appropriately wondering, because if we can't call ourselves and our world into question, none of the other virtues are attainable for us.
Right.
Can I throw another formulation in here just for fun? In the Buddhist tradition, you have Sutrayana, which is about renunciation. It's about training in moral virtue. And it's about, it's about taming and controlling your emotions and desires and becoming wise and compassionate in the world. And then the next level, Tantrayana, you step into another kind of world, which isn't it's no longer a process of training. It's more like you're hit directly by the energies. And so those two things. So and of course, once you enter Tantriana, you also have to have embodied Sutriana. Like you have to become a morally virtuous person before you can wrestle with those more direct energies.
That's deeply analogous to the Neoplatonic ascent, right? So so the Plotinus you have what he calls the civic virtues, which is the virtues, and this is the virtue of being, living with others, what we normally call the moral virtues, but they're much more, like was said here, the understanding that even the moral virtues are not purely individual projects. They have to be done in community and in concert with other people. And then you have what he calls, the cathartic or the purging virtues. These are the virtues that take you beyond moral virtue, because now what you're trying to do is you're not trying to be honest or be good. You're trying to see that about which the depths of you and the depths of reality afford this. This is a transmoral sense of goodness, and this is what takes you towards the good.
It's also, I was thinking rational, transrational.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. That's exactly what it is in Plotinus. That's exactly what it is. You take rational, or what we could call here argumentation, as far as it goes, and what it's done is it's basically a scaffold that brings you up to a place where you can now see and be opened up to. So I sometimes think of it like building a structure. Have you ever been in one of the pyramids in the Mayan jungles? You climb up the pyramid, and the point of the structure is to get to a place where you are struck in a way you can't be struck when you're in the forest, and you're open to calling yourself and your world into question. Argumentation is the building of the pyramid, but when you can then be open to the sky and to the forest below you, and you're willing to call everything now into question.
And is that moving
like
from this propositional sort of understanding of things to a more spontaneous and, let's say, dynamic?
It's moving into
of things,
perspectival and participatory.
It's like the teleological suspension of the ethical.
Also, I think it moves more into beauty.
It does. It does.
Beauty becomes more beauty and play become more important, where in the beginning you're just slogging away and trying to understand, and you've got your machete and you're cutting your way through the jungle. And
but the thing you have to remember is there's and this goes back to the stuff we were saying earlier about how beauty, how it kills you and resurrects you, and you're never going to become a god in Plato. At most, you're always going to be godlike. And you come out of the cave and see the sun, but you return back into the cave. So the moments in my practice where I touch the one or the sun or the ground of being, they then feed back into when I'm doing the propositional,
the most ordinary sort of thing.
Right? No, yeah. And
of course, I think of the Zen. He comes back to the marketplace with
exactly.
What's it called? I forget the Zen. The Zen parables where he's chasing the bull, and then he's looking for the bull, and then
riding the ox.
Right, he's riding the ox, and then and then there's nothing. There's emptiness, and then he comes back with gifts.
Yeah, exactly. So for me, those moments of transrational, they shine into, they empower, they ensoul, they enliven, they beautify the rational moments. And then the rational moments have appropriate reverence to what is disclosed in the transrational moments.
Okay, that's nice.
Although I guess for someone like Callard, the entire process we've just described is rationality per se.
Well, yeah, the aspiration to rationality and the aspiration to transrationality is itself proleptic rationality in a more comprehensive sense. Yeah. Insofar as we're aspiring to not even just to virtue, but as Andrew said, to something that is beyond virtue, right? The good beyond moral goodness. I think we're engaged in some kind of proleptic process. Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
We're engaged in aspiration.
And the other thing I was thinking about is how normally we think of beauty as something very high up there, very sublime, and we're very, very up here. It's associated with high culture and all that sort of stuff. But it's also, you can find beauty in a rap song. You can find beauty everywhere. Like
Absolutely.
You can find beauty in the lowest, in the most, banal things. It's not something that is necessarily hierarchical or.
But isn't that the same for virtue? We find
Yes.
virtue in our highest ideals, but if that's useless, if you can't find it in the minutia of your life.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's like in the way that well, not by analogy, by identity, the way that the Neoplatonic hypostases are dispersed, ontologically dispersed without somehow being diminished.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. The sun shines, but it doesn't. It's not diminished by its shining. Even though our physics says that's not true, but I get Plotinus's metaphor at least, right?
Yeah.
That being is inexhaustible.
Well, who cares about the physics? Just joking.
The one overflows, or like the Tao Te Ching, right? The Tao is a well that you can just continually draw forth from it.
Yeah.
Right? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I should get going soon, gentlemen. And we're seeming to fall into kind of a wonderful convivial silence anyways.
There's a silence descending on the conversation somewhat. I agree.
And it's a good one, though. It's a really wonderful one.
So what are we going to, we've reinvented beauty and we've reinvented the soul and so what are we going to, and we've reinvented virtue. So what are we going to reinvent next?
Well, like I said, I've been trying to reinvent rationality, and today I was trying to bring them together with reinventing argumentation within dialectic. I just want to keep going. Because
That's a great synthesis, John. Incidentally, like that was a fantastic theoretical synthesis that you opened with. Very, very good.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I'm trying to get at what would dialogical argumentation look like rather than monological argumentation. And I'm trying to get more the sense of logos as drawing together, forwarding insight that moves you to the next proposal that draws together. Like it's different than just premise.
Well, it's embodied in feeling, isn't it? It's brought into the entire realm of feeling in the body rather than just upstairs.
Well, very much. It goes back to your metropolis thing. We're trying to link hand and heart and head together, right? In this sense of argumentation, and so.
And trying to ensoul and hearten and make beautiful all of these things.
Because notice how we were willing. I mean, we came in good faith and we were willing to probe and push and move and challenge. But all that did was afford, right? It just afforded more and more and more. And that's, again, I'm working my way towards this. I'm not claiming anything complete here, but I'm trying to get what this would look like for us.
And incidentally,
thank you for helping me.
Yeah, well, I also want to say, Andrew, that it's very helpful because John and I do this all the time, and because there's a certain shorthand and there's a certain shared vocabulary. One thing that you introduce that we don't really have as much on our own is you introduce the more sort of interrogative challenge.
Yep.
That's actually very helpful, which diminishes a little bit, because once you become very, very, very fluent in how conversant you are with another person, once there's once there's so much of a shared vocabulary that things become, you don't realize how, like when John
like
and I
clairvoyance
speak,
or something.
when John and I speak, just the two of us, we're standing on so many unspoken presumptions and so many sort of shared axioms that a lot goes unchallenged simply because there's so much, there's so much underfoot that sort of goes unacknowledged. But one thing that you add to this, one of the many things you add to this, is that you challenge some of those presumptions. You challenge some of those sort of those unspoken premises that we're standing on without realizing that we're standing on them, whether they be having to do with vocabulary or having to do with the use of certain terms, etc. And that's very, very helpful to in the proper sense of the term, to humiliate the conversation and call it into proper question. And I think you bring that beautifully and very deftly.
And I think you guys are really teaching me something here about listening and finding the right moment to interject. And I do feel like I'm stumbling around a lot of the time, but a bit less so. I feel like there's a harmony coming into these conversations that each time that's a little bit and that just it kind of strikes me and makes me go, wow, that's amazing. Something is really happening here to me. So what you were saying about dialogos being this process where something is being brought out of you that that you couldn't find on your own. I think that's happening to me. That feels really exciting. And alive.
That was maybe the most important thing that was just said of this whole conversation. What you just said there, for me, that's exemplifying everything that I'm trying to bring to life. What you just said, that for me is the golden moment. What you just said. So thank you for that.
Oh well, thank you guys so much.
Here.